Welcome to video 5 for quarter 2, subordinate clauses and complex sentences. And guys, this is where it gets kind of complicated. In the past video 2, we talked about a certain type of conjunction, a subordinate conjunction. We're going to need to kind of know those for this lesson. And we're moving on to a third type of sentence. We're not talking about simple sentences or compound sentences. We're talking about a third type, complex sentences. Complex sentences are basically made up of two clauses, one being dependent and the other being independent. So let's take a look. A dependent or subordinate clause, so same word, also contains a subject and a predicate, so it has a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone because it depends on an independent clause to make sense. So a dependent clause does not make sense on its own. Most of the time it leaves the reader or the person hanging. We don't know what's happened next. Like in my example earlier, if I go to the store. We don't know what happens if you go to the store, so you need an independent clause with it. Usually, a subordinating conjunction, those things we learned about in video 2, introduces a dependent clause. The subordinate conjunction sometimes makes a clause dependent. Although a dependent clause may have a relative pronoun, such as who, whose, whom, which, that, or what. Pardon me, I'm sorry about that. That's my email. So that is the part that's a little bit complicated, kind of advanced, and can be kind of confusing. So pay special attention when we get there. Here's an example of a subordinate conjunction being used with a dependent clause and an independent clause. Liesel's painting stood out vividly is my independent clause because it stands on its own. Paintings stood out, completely okay on its own. However, my dependent clause is when they were displayed against a neutral background. The subordinate conjunction when makes this whole clause dependent on the clause that comes before. Alright, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, talking about those relative pronouns. In some subordinate or dependent clauses, the connecting word also is the subject of the clause. Alright, so in this case, the clown who left his red nose in the dressing room should report to lost and found. The relative pronoun who, which connects the clauses, is the subject of the subordinate clause. Who left his red nose in the dressing room? Who. Okay? What we call this when we've got a clause in the middle of an independent one, the clown should report to lost and found is independent, and this is dependent, we call those interrupting dependent clauses. And that's where they get a little bit complicated. But we write like that an awful lot, so it's good to know. Here are some subordinating conjunctions. Page 41 of your overall language study handbook has a few more. These are broken down into different categories. Lastly, we can put together a complex sentence with a couple formulas that might help us out. A complex sentence is made up of one independent clause and one or more subordinate or dependent clauses, as we've just been learning about how to create a dependent clause. Here are my two formulas. If my dependent clause is first, it is usually followed by a comma, and then the independent clause, and then the period. If we reverse the order, and the independent clause is first, and the dependent clause is second, there usually is no comma. And here's my period. The third type is kind of the advanced one, is when you've got your independent clause and your dependent clause in the middle. That's the interrupting dependent clause. Usually no commas required there. But we'll talk a little bit more about this type in our next video. So, let's do a few together and you'll get a better idea, I hope. Struggling through them is probably going to be the best way to get these. So in each of the following sentences, we're going to double underline the verb and single underline the subjects like we have been. And we're going to circle the subordinating conjunction. And we're going to label the clauses as either independent or dependent. The example has the dependent clause first. Although the diesel engine was new, it broke down on its first run. Let's do 2, 3, and 4 together. After I had read the instructions carefully, I began to answer the questions. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is look for some subordinating conjunctions, because I know I'm looking to see if I can find a dependent clause. Here's my subordinating conjunction. It's up here on the time list. So after I had read the instructions carefully, comma, that's probably my dependent clause because I bet I'm following this formula. I began to answer the questions. That's something that stands on its own. So I'm going to go dependent clause, independent clause. Now I just need to find my subjects and verbs. So I had read, I began. Okay. Let's take a look at 3. It's going to be a different one. The breed that I like to train the most is the collie. This is an example of our third type, an independent clause being interrupted by a dependent clause. So I'm looking first for my subordinating conjunction, and I see this word. That's a subordinating conjunction sometimes. So that I like to train the most. I like dependent clause. And what then, I'm going to kind of bracket it, is left. The breed is the collie. That's my independent clause. So breed is. I'll just do this so we know it's the independent clause. Pardon me again, that's my email. Let's do number 4, and then we'll practice a few more in class together. Pam always likes to read for 30 minutes before she goes to sleep. Same thing, I'm going to look for a subordinating conjunction first. Here it is, before. So I'll take a look at what comes after. Before she goes to sleep. Yep, there's my dependent clause, because it's got a subject, a verb, and it's got the subordinating conjunction introducing it. So this should be my independent clause. Pam always likes to read for 30 minutes. Yep, Pam likes. Right? Actually, why don't you see about 5, 6, and 7 on your own, and then we'll do a few more together in class.